Hey guys, Davis Mallory again on another episode of Leaving a Legacy podcast. Today I want to introduce you to a new friend of mine, Aubray Scott. She has her own podcast herself called Rooftop Culture. We met just last weekend at Think Conference. It was the second year of its existence. It's a brand new conference. Think of it like a TED Talk, but with faith thought leaders in different spaces. It was really cool. I had the chance to get to know your story, and I'm excited to share it with you all today on this week's episode of Leaving a Legacy.
Don't let it shake your faith when it seems like you're so far from amazing grace. Don't let it shake.
So Aubrey, as I said, we got a chance to talk at Think, and you were sharing with me some of your stories, and you're involved in a lot of missions work, just like different cultures of the world. You've been firsthand, like on the grounds, serving the Lord and being Jesus on earth in a way, just helping different people through different struggles they're going through. Do you want to start by picking one of the different many ways you've been involved in?
I feel like if I just gave a overall thing of what I do is I bridge the gap in certain communities and I cultivate intimacy. So I create safe spaces for people in general. So this has taken me to places of human trafficking victims, orphans in India and Africa, as well as working with gangsters and drug addicts. I've worked with people in the sex industry, coming out of the sex industry, special needs community, anything you name it. There's not one people group that I have not touched or been deeply immersed in. So that's kind of what I would say it has looked like.
You're originally from Texas, right?
Mm-hmm.
But you've lived most of your life outside of the U.S., isn't that right?
Yes, most of my adult life has been outside of America.
Where have you lived?
I've lived in Asia, Africa, and Europe. So the first place that I went by myself when I was 23 was China. I moved to China. And then the most recent place I lived in was Bali, Indonesia.
And what led you to China?
Honestly, I wanted to live in a place that was the most different from America. And at 17, I went to India by myself. So I already did India, and I felt like that was really different. And the next most different was China. And so I moved there. Ever since the sixth grade, I wanted to travel the world, help people, and bring music to the world. And at that point in my life, when I was 22, I had walked out of a really abusive relationship. I was the prodigal, so I walked away from my family. I hated Christians, and I was no longer doing music in any form or fashion. I couldn't help people because I couldn't help myself. So I was like, well, I might as well travel. And I just Googled jobs and moved to China.
Talk to me about the time in China. Like, what happened there?
So in China, what's crazy is I started studying every religion in China. I had a job, so I was a teacher. I taught advanced English to business professionals, so how to conduct a boardroom meeting, and I taught them about culture and all of those kinds of things. So that was my position there. But then on the flip side, I was researching every religion: Buddhism, Jainism, Sikhism, Hinduism, Islam. I prayed to all the gods. Allah, are you real? Show me. Buddha, are you real? Show me. Crickets, crickets, crickets. And cynically, I came back to Jesus and I was like, okay, God of unconditional love, where were you when I was sexually abused as a child? Where were you when there's literal human soldiers in Africa that are still active? Like, I don't see your goodness. And because of my bad experience with the people who weren't the best at representing him, I had a pretty jaded heart towards him. But it was in China that I had this radical encounter with him and my entire life changed. So that's kind of, in a short way, that's my China story.
Like, we could take this in two different directions. Like, first off, what is this radical encounter?
Mm-hmm.
And then second off, like, what was your faith before you left it? Like, what was your upbringing like?
Yeah, for sure. So this radical encounter, it wasn't like a thunder and lightning. It was, unironically, I walked into a church, a Christian or faith-based, Christian church in China. And the thing about churches in China is they're still under the communist regimen. And so no church is truly free. So the first time I went to church, the next weekend, 250 people were arrested in that church. And I was like, okay, I guess I'm not going to church. And so I went back, and this is after I had studied all of these different religions. And I went back and I just had a Bible. I don't even know how I got a Bible because I didn't take a Bible to China, but somehow I ended up with a Bible. And I started reading it, and it was in my apartment that it was like in this moment I felt so loved by God, and I'd never experienced that kind of love in my entire life. And it had nothing to do with what I did, what had happened to me, the choices that I had made, nothing that I could perform or produce. It had everything to do with like the entire reason you're on the planet is because I love you. And it completely changed my life in that moment. It wasn't, and even in that, it wasn't like I became a completely different person the next day, because it was, I had to let go of some junk that happened to me, obviously, because I was still pretty bitter and I had a bad experience with certain people. But it was in that moment that I knew God had showed me, you put these people on a pedestal, and while Christians should be different, they're still people. And I'm going to use your life to go back for the ones who are lost, the ones who are left behind. Because many times the ones who are lost are the ones who nobody went looking for in the first place. And that's kind of been my life is I was a have-not, a reject, a radical, cut from a different cloth. And I didn't really ever fit in. And because of that, I think sometimes we tend to overlook people or they fall through the cracks. But my life in general has been the life that, hey, we're going to bring everybody to the table. We're always going to bring chairs. We're going to build a longer table so that everybody truly feels welcome. And that's kind of how God used that season of these people should be different, but they're still people. But I'm going to use your life to be the one that looks different. So that was kind of like the encounter that I had. Up until before that part, I was raised by incredible Christian parents. My dad was a new Christian when I was young. He moved to Texas to sell cocaine. So sex, drugs, rock and roll. I call my parents the saint in the sinner because my mom was, this precious, sweet little Southern lady. She's super poised and, always has her hair done and her lipstick on and never did anything. She's never been drunk. I heard her say 4 cuss words in my entire life, and I wrote every single one of them down. So they meshed together, and I saw how even as a child, like my dad was angry, not towards us, but angry because of his own life. But he prayed every day in his lazy boy recliner at 6:30 a.m. every single day of my entire life. And I saw God, even in my adulthood, radically change him. So I grew up with parents who were really pursuing God, and it wasn't just to check off boxes. That was actual their heartbeat. And so, I got saved at a young age, and I feel like looking back at it, I really was on fire for God. I would go to Mexico on mission trips and speak Spanish to people door to door and knock and be a little evangelist, and I was a firecracker. If you were on the playground with me, I would bring my Bible and be like, we're going to get you saved, which is so funny. But later on in life is when I went to college, and I was involved in church and all of those things, but having a real relationship with God is different than going through the motions and just checking off the boxes. And I really didn't have an intimate relationship with Jesus. And so when I got in that abusive relationship, he didn't believe in God at all, and it pushed me away from my faith in general. And I think because of the things that happened in that relationship, it made me question if God was good. And so I don't think I ever didn't believe in God. I questioned the goodness of God and his character because of the experiences that I had. And then in that, I became the prodigal. I walked away from my family for 3 years. It didn't look like I carried Jesus at all. And so what happened to me in China was, in that encounter, it was like a real relationship was starting to be cultivated. And that was the difference for me.
So you mentioned your work, and I kind of wanted to get into that next, like the work that you've done since in different parts of the world, because you've lived in some fascinating places. I know this from talking to you, but the audience doesn't yet know. But tell them you've lived in, like, where all you've lived.
Yeah. So I've lived in Asia, Africa, and Europe.
Yeah.
I lived in Cape Town, actually in a pretty sketchy area. When I tell people from South Africa or from Cape Town where I live, they're like, Mitchell's Plains, you lived in the hood.
Oh, yeah.
But I worked with gangsters and drug addicts it was kind of like a halfway house. So they were coming out of prison, and they were going through a faith-based program for a month to 6 months until they were sent back out to their home. And so that was probably one of my most favorite, like, ministries or whatever you want to call it that I did, just because even in that, like, a lot of the things that God took me to and through, it restored and redeemed my own story, because I had a really negative perspective of men in general. And then I'm with the hardest men who literally have bullets still stuck in their body. I'm sitting across from a rapist who has raped multiple women, and he's like, I really am sorry. And as somebody who is a victim of rape, it was like God was using these men who were having, encounters with him and were going through their own story of redemption to redeem the very hard parts of my own story. So that's just like Cape Town. I did that. In Nepal, I would go out and I would raise awareness for human trafficking, because in a lot of the lower income, most of Nepal, it's a third world country, but the villages, they literally live in dirt huts. So you go out there and it's like National Geographic. And what happens is a lot of people from India come over and recruit these 8-year-old kids and tell their family members, hey, let your kid come to India. They're going to work in a factory. They'll send money back so that you have money. But what's actually happening is they're trafficking them. They never see their children again. And so I would go into these, in the middle of nowhere, I would hike and walk to these villages and raise awareness to what's actually happening. Because when you aren't educated or you're unaware of things happening, then, obviously they send their kids off and then they never see them again. So that was one of the things that I did in Thailand. I worked with a lot of people in the sex industry, nightlife culture. You would catch me at the bar. I would be talking to the women who, were selling themselves. And then that led to me also sitting at the bar across from the very men who were making the purchase and having conversations with them. I remember one time I looked at this guy. I was just sitting next to him having a drink, and I started crying. And I was like, why are you here? And he was like, what? I started crying. I was like, why are you here? Do you not know how loved you are? And he broke down and was just like, I was abandoned by my father. I was sexually abused as a kid. And yeah, that's how I ended up here. And I was like, you literally were born to be loved. And I think even in that, because of my story and my history of like, I worked in the sex industry. That's a part of my story as well. And it's a whole crazy story because God protected me in that. Like, I never had sex with anybody. I never even held somebody's hand. So I was literally in that industry, but hidden in plain sight. So God protected me there. But to sit across from a man who, it's one level of brokenness to sell yourself, but it's a whole other level of brokenness to buy a human. And that's what that looks like. And so there's so many places and spaces that the Lord has asked me to show up in. And it has been redemptive to my own story. So, and I just think that that's how God works.
I know when we talked about the Thailand story, you taught me something that I didn't know, but you were saying in Thailand, a lot of families expect one of their children to work in the sex industry because it's a way to get income.
Yes, yeah.
And that you were even saying some of them, that if they only have boys as children, they transition one of their children to become a girl.
Yeah. So actually, the whole transgender thing, that has been so popular in Thailand for many, many, many years. And what happens is they call them lady boys. So that's just the verbiage that they use over there. And when I first went, I went there in 2012, and I was like, dang, these people are prettier than me, and it's a man. But I sat with these people, and I remember asking these men, did you choose this? And that's how I found out that sex industry is the highest, most prominent industry in Thailand. So almost every family, unless they have wealth, has somebody, a family member, working in the sex industry. So if you have daughters, you're good. But if you have all boys, usually what happens is the youngest child is chosen and they start helping them transition. So they don't have a choice. They are transitioning. They are getting estrogen. They're getting, groomed to be a woman. So by the time they're 18, that's their life. So they are literally used as that. And it's a really hard, especially in America, or globally, it can be a polarizing conversation because it's a choice. But a lot of times in places like Thailand, it wasn't a choice. They did not have a choice.
Yeah.
And so I've sat with these men who are like, no, I wanted to be a father one day. And like, now I can't because I don't have the actual ability to be a father.
Yeah.
So it's really crazy. I think even in that, it's just the conversations that I've had because of the places that God's enabled me to walk in, and really just trusting me to hear people's stories is such a privilege, and it's honestly humbling because I've heard a lot of really crazy stories, and I've been educated in ways that most people would never have access to that kind of education.
Yeah. Well, that leads me to one more story that I want you to share, but that I also want to learn about the education. Like, how did you get educated to do this? And then I wanted to hear about your time in Bali.
Yeah, so Bali's crazy. So 2017, I got asked to go on a press trip to Bali from a travel company. I don't even know what they were doing, but they just asked me to come for 2 weeks, and then it turned into 1 month, and it was going to be all paid, all inclusive. And at the time, I had a job, like I had a full-time position here. And long story short, I quit my job, and I reached back out to this company, and I said, okay, yeah, I can come to Bali. And when I went, it was all these videographers, photographers, storytellers. And I was like, why am I here? I'm not a blogger. I don't even have a website. All I did was post on social media the stories and the people that I met. And so I spent a month with this group of people, and we just became really, really close friends. And a lot of them created videos and content for this travel company. And at the end, I was just like, okay, I still don't know why I was here. And the owner of it had come to me and she said, you opened your house in America, because I was back in America for 2 years. And she was like, you opened your house to somebody, and he was backpacking all over America, and he came and stayed at your house, and he knew that I was starting this travel company, and he said, you have to have Aubray. And she was like, oh, what does she do? And he's like, well, it's not what she does, it's who she is. She literally sits with people, and she creates like this intimacy where people can truly be themselves unapologetically. And she just brings unity, and she'll like listen to everybody's stories, and just in her listening, like things happen. And it was crazy because I didn't go there to do something. I just went there to be who I am. And that's really just to love people. And I was the one person who I knew every single person's story. I was the person who kind of brought everybody together, and we would always be laughing and stuff like that. And so that's how Bali started. When I was there for the month, I met so many people, and a lot of people come to Bali to find themselves. And the thing about the travel community is you see a lot of people who are traveling all over the world in search for themselves, but you'll never know who you are until you know whose you are. And so they're really searching for God. And every conversation I have with people, because I don't push my faith onto people, I'm just like, yeah, this is what happened. Like, Jesus saved my life. And they're like, wait, what? You believe in Jesus? Oh, you're religious? And I'm like, no, I'm not that kind of religious. And then I go into it. And then when I talk about who God actually is and his heartbeat for us, that it's literally that we're born to be loved, they're like, I've never heard anything like that before, but if that's true, I believe in that. And so this was like almost every conversation, whether I went on a date with somebody, met a girl at a coffee shop, whatever, it was the same outcome. And I started praying about it, and I just felt like the Lord said, I want you to come back to Bali. I want you to move here. And in all honesty, I was like, no, I've already done Asia. I've like lived abroad for so long. It's so far away. And most people think I'm crazy because they're like, you complaining about Bali, girl, But I wrestled with God for, a couple of weeks over it, and then ended up moving there long-term in 2018. And I knew that I was supposed to host trips and retreats and have intimate table experiences with people and just hear their stories. And that's all that I really knew. And then when I showed up to Bali, a lot of things started happening and doors started opening. And yeah, I did, whether it was ended up in a pastoral position unintentionally, which is not what I signed up for. I did that for a while. I became the person who, if there was rape cases or suicidal things, people would call me and be like, hey, we need you to show up. So I was kind of on 24/7 in Bali, on top of in Bali specifically, there is a divide amongst the locals and the expat community, which are the people who are traveling and they come in from foreign countries and they live there. There's such a divide just based off of what they make. And I'm the person who was like, we should all be sitting at the table together. Like, everybody should have a spot regardless of the income they make. And so that's kind of like my biggest passion is letting people know that we can all sit at the table from all walks of life, experiences, races, cultures, backgrounds, and upbringings. And so I did a lot of different things over there that most people don't even know about because you can't really. It's like, how do you get on social media and tell people all the things that you're doing, you know?
And you would share with me that as you kind of mentioned that a lot of people go to Bali to heal from something. And so sometimes they were not getting healed after the end of spending a bunch of money, for example. And they were pretty distraught. Like what stories happened like that you witnessed?
Yeah. So a lot of people come over and they pay for these week retreats, or they go and see a healing guru, or, you know, they go to all the different healing ceremonies. And what happens is a lot of them don't actually get healed. And my friend, who's one of my very close friends, she is she's like this all tatted up. She's from Khmer, or she's Cambodian, so she's from the Khmer background, and she's Australian. But she knew that when I sit at tables with people that healing does occur. So people would reach out and be like, I'm suicidal and I went to this guru and nothing happened. She's like, oh, you have to connect with Aubray.
Okay.
And so that's kind of what would happen is I wouldn't tell people like, I'm a healer, you know, it's Jesus that heals. But sometimes things do happen. And I truly believe that if Jesus died on the cross for our salvation, then healing should be simple, right? A lot of times I think we're like, oh, healing is too crazy, you know? Especially if you're not in the Christian community, or even if you are in the Christian community, when you pray for a miracle to happen, like somebody has cancer, and you're like, no, you don't. Like, the fact is you may have cancer, but truth always supersedes fact. And the truth is God already died for all the iniquity, all the sicknesses. That is already nailed to the cross. You just have to receive it. And so I think that a part of my story in that is I don't broadcast myself as like a healing guru, but God used my life to walk people through the hard parts of their story, and they did receive healing. And well, honestly, even that's a privilege and not something that I showed up and even expected, you know, to be used as. Yeah.
And so how did you get your training in this? Was it a natural gift, or was there some course you took? Or
Well, I mean, it was all just It's kind of like, you know, those people who they learn to swim, but you throw them into the water and they don't know how to swim. It's just like, figure it out.
Yeah.
I feel like that's kind of what happened for me. Of course, you know, in life, I did go to college, and I lived abroad, and I started having these experiences with different people. And I was under an actual missional program under an organization for a year, but that was, you know, over a decade ago. And everything else was just really the Lord cultivating things in me and teaching me things and giving me wisdom and discernment. And sometimes it doesn't even make sense, because I know a lot of times, like, I've walked people through deaths, like having a widow. I've walked people through infidelity in marriage, and I'm not married. But I think that God has just given me a lot of wisdom. He gave me a lot of wisdom at a young age. And I think when you keep your eyes on Him and you're pursuing Him, He just gives you the ability to show up and know how to facilitate that. Because it's not about me at all. It's literally Him in me. Because I'm just a little country bumpkin girl from a tiny Texas town who most people would say is unqualified. But God is the one who ultimately qualifies us. And yeah, that's kind of what my life has looked like.
You mentioned you've worked in orphanages. What have you done with orphanages?
Yeah, so one of the orphanages that I worked in was in India. And in India, you know, it's one of the most impoverished countries in the world, and it has 1/3 of the world's population. And I was living in a tiny little village. And honestly, I didn't know what my thing was to do there. But every day I woke up and I would teach them dance. So I do salsa, merengue, cumbia, bachata. And I would teach them how to dance just for fun. Just because nobody really, you know, they can go to Bible study and all of these certain things. But to actually laugh with them and hang out with them and be kind of a parent figure to them is unique. And so that's what I did in that orphanage. I mean, at nighttime, I would go out and evangelize. I would give messages in towns. I would like hold a mic, and I sang Shackles, if you know that song by Mary Mary. I did that like on that side, but my favorite part of living in the actual orphanage was just fostering a real relationship with the kids and kind of being like a mother figure to them, because they have foster parents. They were in their late 60s, so there was a massive gap because these kids are between the age of 2 and 12. The oldest was 12. And so the parents took them in, and they were the most precious parents ever. I can't imagine, being 60 years old and taking in 12 kids.
Yeah.
And yeah, they were just the most sweet people. But my time there was just like, hey, have a relationship with them and have fun with them and teach them, whatever it is in life. Just have conversations with them. And one of the last days that I was leaving, one of the girls, her name's Regina, she looked at me and she's like, will you be my mommy? And I was 25 at the time. And I remember crying and being like, Lord, is this what you have for me? Am I supposed to adopt? And I imagined myself, pushing her in the little shopping cart, walking through the grocery store. I mean, I literally could see it. And I was still on the mission field for the next 6 months. So it's not like I could make a decision. But in that 6 months, the Lord was like, this isn't what I have for you, but I just wanted you to have a posture of heart where you are willing to do something. But even in that, like, there's children around the world who have asked me to be their mom. And I mean, I cry when I think about it, because I'm just like, oh my gosh, it's one thing to choose a child, but it's another thing for a child to choose you. So, yeah.
Another story that you shared with me, I think that I wanted to also kind of have echoed today, was the story about an area in Africa, you said, where there was a lot of incest in a certain family, and about how you feel like the devil uses certain locations as a place on earth to sort of target. And I thought that was really fascinating to
So that's Swaziland, and that's another orphanage that I lived in. And in Swaziland, there is like this spirit of perversion and immoral sexuality there. And I really do believe that every country has some stronghold, and that comes from the enemy, right? And so Swaziland specifically, it is that perversion and sexual immorality. So a lot of people there, if you're traveling there, you may have dreams that are around that. A lot of the kids are sexually abused by their own parents. And what happens in that specific orphanage is a lot of the kids, if their parents don't want them, they'll hang them upside down in trees. And they're just villagers or locals will find them and cut them down and bring them to the village. So in that, I actually lived with the teenagers, and I was living in a room with 3 teenagers, and 2 were sisters. And their names are Jabu and Otondo. And what happened was the mother, her husband got into a car accident, and then he survived, but he contracted sepsis, and he ended up dying. Well, the mother had a psychotic break because she was so distraught that her husband died. So she had 3 children at the time, and she stabbed all of them almost to death. So Jabu has stab wounds all over her back. Her older brother has his head is shaved, so he had stab wounds all over his head. And then she got arrested. She was put in prison, and Notondo was actually born in prison. And so this is just one of the stories. I lived with these girls, and I remember going through my own story of forgiving somebody who had hurt me, like the bad relationship. It seems like a cakewalk in comparison to this story. But I was going through this, forgiving my ex-boyfriend at the time of the heartbreak that I'd gone through and the abuse and all of that. And I remember one day Jabu asked me, she was like, can you teach us about forgiveness? Because we really want to forgive our mom. Because Jabu was 15, Otondo was 12, but her mom had been in prison their entire life and was about to be released. And so they just said, can you show us what forgiveness is? And I'm like, dang, I don't even know forgiveness in comparison to this. And so I walked them through, I was like, I can't even fathom or identify or relate to this, but I want you to know that God, these are the things that God has done for us. And it's really hard, Forgiveness doesn't always mean reconciliation either. We hope that, right? We hope to reconcile with people, especially when we love them. But sometimes even in relationships with parents or siblings or close friends, reconciliation doesn't occur because reconciliation takes both parties. We see that with Judas in the Bible. Judas could have had reconciliation. He could have, because Christ died on the cross for him as well, but he didn't make that choice. And so just that story alone, Jabu was one of the ones she wrote. I would have certain people who were older that I would come across while I was on the road traveling as a missionary, to have them like write little notes. And I have a book where she was like, "You gave me a love my own mother couldn't give me." And a lot of this, it's not to give me glory. It's literally God. I'm like, God took me to these places in my own brokenness. I was a basket case. They actually didn't want to let me be a missionary because I was so messed up. I was hard. You know, I came out of the industry. I weighed 85 pounds. I almost died. My heart almost stopped beating. I hated Christians. I actually couldn't stand a lot of the missionaries I was with. I was like, yo, these people are like, you know, they're lucky to be alive because I'm a hood rat in my background. Like pre-Jesus Aubray wasn't cute. And so, I mean, it tested your faith for sure and your grace. And I learned a lot of things. But just to look at that time, because I was 2013, I was like, I was a basket case. Like it was not cute. I was going through my own crap. Like every month, God delivered me from something significant and used something that he was like, I want you to show up and minister to this. And I was just like, me, I have no experience. I have no education. I don't even have any skin in the game because I'm still a wrecked and a basket case myself. But I think even in that, it's one of those things that a lot of people say, you don't do it until you're healed, or you can't help people until you're healed. That's not true, because God can actually use you if you're broken, as long as you surrender to him and let him guide your steps. And he gets the glory in it, because anybody who knows me back then, they were like, yeah, you were a sketch magetch, you know? Like, I have a guy who is a missionary too, and he was like, I was scared of you, and he's 6'6", and he put his hand on me the first month we were on the field, and I was like, don't ever touch me again. And I was that's how I was to men in general. And so, but by the end of the year, I was like giving people physical touch and like putting my cheek to people, you know, and like kissing people on the cheek. And I was a completely different person. I mean, I was a completely different person after 3 months on the field. And a lot of that has to do with, I so didn't want to be the Aubray that I had become. I wanted to be, because healing doesn't mean going back to who you were before. It means everything that God actually intended you to be. And I was like, that's who I want to be. I want to be the Aubray that before he created me in the womb, he knew me. I want to be that Aubray. And I think that surrender and pursuit, on top of all of the people praying for me, because I know so many people were praying for me, that it made me accelerate to change and to heal so quick. And in that, it was just like the experiences that God gave me being out there, it doesn't make sense, honestly.
So if someone feels called to do this kind of work, how does someone support themselves financially through this? How do you support yourself financially? And how can someone else do something like this?
Well, I mean, a lot of people, if they are called to be an international missionary or something, they get attached to a church or a nonprofit or something like that. I know a lot of people support Raise. That wasn't my story. It would have been nice if that was my story. But the Lord told me, you know how to work, and you gonna work, girl. And so in 2016, I bought a house. I was living in it, and this is when I was in America, and I had a real job. And at the time, I started Airbnb one room in my house, and it was like $15. So I wasn't, making bank or anything. But then when I went to Bali, the Lord said, okay, Airbnb your entire house. So that's actually how I supported myself abroad, was off of one house. I wasn't living the 5-star luxury hotel, life, but God provided, and it was never something that I struggled with. There were seasons where I was like, okay, God, you're going to put somebody in that bedroom because I need to eat. But God always like supported me in that way. So that's one of the things that I did was I'm a hustler. So I detailed cars, I mowed lawns, I did landscaping, I cleaned houses full time. There's nothing that I scrubbed a lot of toilets to be out there loving people. And then when people would hear about it, there's one man in specifically, because the first year that I was out on the field, you had to raise $20,000 throughout the year. And I was just like, I came from the industry, you know, and people didn't know who I was. I wasn't affiliated or attached to a church. So how am I going to ask these Christians to support me, you know? Like the only pictures that I had on social media is me looking scandalous and in my mini dresses. So I think even in that, I applied to this mission program in April, got accepted in April. I went to the first thing in May, and I was supposed to raise $3,500 by May, and I couldn't. So I signed the check myself, and I had made money in China as a teacher, so I had cash. So I wrote the check trusting that God was going to provide, and I prayed a pretty radical prayer. I was like, God, I want to be fully funded before July 4th. July 4th was when we launch and go like we're living abroad. And people support Raise throughout the year. You know, they don't expect you to have 20 grand up front. And so I went to the training and then came back and I was just hustling. I was doing all the things that I said, landscaping, cleaning cars. I sold like a lot of the things that I did have before I moved to China. I sold things, a bed, a TV, anything that I had that had, you know, any kind of worth to it. And because of that, people started becoming more generous because they would hear, like, this guy who's a biker, he said, wait, so you're scrubbing toilets to go love people around the world and spread the gospel? And I was like, when you say it that way, it makes me look real good. And I was like, yes, that's what I do. And so later that evening, him and his wife were like, hey, we want to hear more of your story. And so they came. We were staying at a hotel at the time because my parents' house flooded. And we were staying at a hotel, and they showed up to the hotel. And we sat on, you know, the bed in the hotel, and this couple they're bikers, like hardcore bikers. And they show up and they're just like, so what's your story? And I told them my story. And I hadn't really shared my story with a lot of people, you know. I'm like, yeah, I came from the industry. I was a prodigal. Like, I really don't know what I'm doing with my life. I don't guess I need to, because all I need to know is my eyes are on the prize, and that's Jesus. And at the time, like, I thought I had raised around 13 grand just mowing lawns and cleaning houses and doing all this. And this man handed me an envelope, and he wrote a check for $5,000. And when I put it into the Excel, like, that was exactly $20K that I raised in 23 days. And so even in that, the story of radical provision that God's had on my life, like, there's been seasons where I struggled and I, you know, lived $80 a month, and I prayed. I was like, Lord, I'm just hungry. And somebody showed up with fried chicken on my doorstep. But that literally has been my story of God has never let me starve. You know, he's never let me go without. And when it comes to provision specifically, I have so many miracle stories of radical provision on my life. And that's just one of them.
Anyone you want to add, or you kind of?
I mean, I think even in that, like my house, and I feel like this is a good story, just because my house, I drove around this neighborhood in my city. I got called back to this neighborhood. And when I say called back, I ain't trying to get Christianese with people who are listening to this if they're not Christians. But I lived in Spain, and a girl, she had a heart for the special needs community. And that was the only community that I had no experience in. And so I started praying about it, and she was like, I really want you to co-found this nonprofit with me. And I ended up helping co-found this nonprofit. We both agreed to move back to Texas, to this specific city. I had never met her in this city, but she happened to be from my hometown, which was really crazy. And it has a massive special needs community because it's outside of the Metroplex, the DFW of Texas. And so a lot of parents will ship their children to this city. And so it's a really large community. And so I had a heart for the parents, and she had a heart for the kids. And a lot of them are adults, so it's not like they're little bitty kids. They're actual adults. But God just gave me a heart for the parents because he's like, they've been overlooked as well. And so I agreed to move back for 2 years. And when I moved back, I was like, well, I have a heart for having an open door. I want people to know that they can walk in, whether they come from the sex industry, they're a stripper, whatever community or lifestyle that they live in. I want them to know that they have a seat at the table because I have monthly potlucks at my house. Or that was always what I wanted to do. And so I started driving around a neighborhood. It was my favorite neighborhood in Wichita Falls. And it was the historic district. It was right outside of the country club. It's little cottage houses, from the 1940s. And I drove 9 times around. I circled this neighborhood. I was like, please, God, help me to own property in this neighborhood. And I ended up getting a realtor. I looked at 90 houses. I put an offer on a house outside of that neighborhood. It didn't go through. And then I finally told my realtor, I was like, I'm done. I'm not looking at a single house again. And I told the Lord, I said, if I don't get a house in 2 months, I'm out of here. Which I know when you're listening to this, you're kind of like, are you a brat, Aubray? But I just knew God is a God when his word is good. And I knew that he had a home for me. And that was me being like, okay, God, I've done it in my own. I've tried, I've made the effort to try to find this house and it's not happening. So you're going to either bring me this house or I'm deucing. I'm leaving this place because I had been back a year at this point. And I was living with my parents, which, I think I was 27 at the time. I was like, I'm 27. I can't be here. And so I ended up going to a flea market. And this woman, she had this really cool furniture at this flea market. And she's like, I was like, I love all your stuff. She's like, you need to buy all my stuff. And I said, no, I can't. I don't even have a house. She's like, oh, I have a house for sale. I was like, I'm not interested. I'm over looking at houses. And she was like, it's in Brook Village. Well, that's the neighborhood that I drove circles around. And I was like, yeah, not interested. I looked at the taxes. They're $300 a month. This is Hillbillyville, Texas. A house that's 1940s for $300 a month on taxes. That's high, And she's like, well, let me call my daughter. And so she calls her daughter, and her daughter's like, oh, the taxes are $120 because we've owned the house. We're the only owners of the house. We've had it for 50 years. I was like, And so my friend who's with me is like, you should go look at that house. And I was like, I don't know. And then the woman tells me, if you want to meet after the flea market, I'll go see this house with you. And one of the things that I had made a list of what I wanted in a house. I wanted it to be in Brook Village. I wanted all hardwood floors. I wanted it to have character. I really wanted trees because there's no trees in North Texas. I wanted a big garage, and I wanted to have a massive closet because I love fashion. And when I was a missionary, the Lord told me, you got to leave your high heels behind. And so I really wanted this big closet. And so it was like a very specific thing that I prayed over. And I walk into this house, and there's 3 different textures of popcorn ceiling. It looked like Stevie Wonder had done one of the ceilings. There's spotlight, stoplight, red paint everywhere. There's plastic everywhere. I mean, there's no doors on the entire house. There's no cabinets on the entire house. And this woman tells me, oh, my dad, who's in his 80s, is trying to renovate it. It's actually not for sale. I was like, girl, how you going to show me a house that ain't even for sale? She's like, I just feel like my dad needs to sell this house and you could be the person. What do you think? And I was like, I knew in my spirit, I was like, this is my house. I knew it. But also I was like, how you going to show me a house that ain't for sale? And so I was like, okay. So she called her dad. 2 weeks later, he drives, to the city. I meet him. He's like, so what do you think? And I made him a vocal offer. We shook hands. We wrote on a notebook piece of paper, like, this is the price. These are the details. I wrote him a $1,200 escrow check, and it was very much like an old school transaction. And 2 months later, I owned that house, and I had prayed for 3-bedroom, 2-bathroom. It was 5-bedroom, 3-bathroom, all hardwood floors, 1940, so has tons of character, 3 pecan trees in the backyard, a 3-car garage. And it was on Victory Avenue. And I feel like even in that, like, God doesn't just give you the little things, like he does exceedingly abundantly more than you can ever hope, think, or imagine. And if he does that for a house, then how much more will he do it for the calling on your life, the people that you're supposed to share life with, or the person that you're supposed to one day marry? Because that's just a house,
Yeah.
And that house was the very thing that when I did live abroad, it was the thing that provided for me to live abroad for over 2 years.
Wow.
And it opened the doors to a lot of other things as well.
Did you rent it fully out or just some of the bedroom?
At first, I ended up letting a girl who lived in Spain who I'd never met. She came and lived with me for a year. And then I Airbnb'd an upstairs bedroom because it has a bathroom up there. And then when I left, there was always one room that was just my closet. So like when I say I wanted a whole room that was a closet, that room was never rented out because it was my closet. When I moved to Bali, 4 bedrooms were always in use. And even in that, because I didn't necessarily want to come back to America, I was like, I like the people and the culture and diversity. And within my first year of being back in America and owning that house, somebody from every single continent came and stayed in my house. And God was like, I will bring the nations to you. You don't even have to leave. And so there's a lot of things like that God, did for me. Because even in that house, I hadn't worked on paper in America since 2010 because I had lived abroad. And I got a job a month before. That's why there's it took 2 months because I didn't really have a job. And then I got a job and I had only had the job for a month, which doesn't make sense how I got approved for a mortgage. So I had a job for a month and then got approved for a loan and then was in that house in mid-August of 2016. Yeah.
Now, where's the future heading for you? Do you think you're going to stay in Texas or what's the next chapter of your life?
Yeah. Well, I don't know what the future holds. That house is actually for sale right now.
No way.
So the Lord told me the grace for this place is about to be removed last summer. And then I had to sell a lot of things. I had an estate sale, like actually more than one estate sale, and sold a lot of things and listed it in March. And so the market has not been, it's kind of slow right now. It's starting to pick up now. So I am selling it and it's in a kind of like a leap of faith. I don't know what's next, who's next, where's next, or when is next, but the Lord told me to sell it and then I'll know what's next. So I don't know. I'm praying about what city I'm supposed to be in, but I know that I will be on the road a lot because I am launching a podcast and we'll kind of see. I don't know.
So tell us about your podcast and where people can find it.
Yeah. So it's called Rooftop Culture Podcast and it'll be across all platforms. It's not live right now. I'm getting a whole season first, but the heartbeat is everybody has a story to tell. And a lot of times we don't share our stories because of shame or whatever. But the moment that you start sharing your story, it enables freedom for you, but also for other people. So that's a big part of it. And then another really big part of it is I believe the enemy has silenced men across the globe. And we see that in many different avenues. But it's kind of like passing the mic to men and being like, I want to actually create a safe space where you can truly share your story, be vulnerable. Tears are welcome, emotions are welcome. It's not a sign of weakness. And in that, it also fosters a way to like educate women how to support men in their life. Because I think a lot of times women are like, I want men to be vulnerable. And then the moment a man is vulnerable, a woman can't steward that space well, or they can't handle it, or like, oh, I'm freaked out because now you're supposed to be the one that's providing and now you're struggling. And I've sat with so many men all over the globe. This is a global thing. It's not just an American thing where the enemy has really silenced men. And I feel like y'all's stories have so much power, and spiritual leadership starts with vulnerability. And so if men are sharing the hard parts of their story and even the struggles that you guys are currently going through, then that's going to create a domino effect and a generational inheritance globally. Yeah. So, yeah.
That's a fantastic experience. Who have you had on so far? What kind of stories have you cultivated?
Yeah. So I've had a few different men on so far, and as women. On the men's side, a lot of these men are sharing things that they've never shared publicly ever before. And so, it's like there's tears that show up in that space. And even in that, they're like, nobody's ever seen me cry. I'm like, the world's about to see you cry, But they're all different. They come from different backgrounds, whether it's they were in prison or they were sexually abused by somebody that they knew in their life. It's across the board. Because I feel like I'm not trying to share too much right away, but it's not like I'm connected to a lot of people who they just have really good stories. And I think that that's been since I've traveled the world. And when I was on social media, my heart behind social media, most of what I've done on social media is in my DMs. It's not even on my page. Because if you look at my page, it's like an inside joke. I'm acting like a clown the whole time. But I've had stories of like one of the women who has shared her story. She was born from a nun who had an affair with a married man. There's another woman her mom put her for sale on a market in Mexico. There's a story of a girl who lived in Hong Kong and she got knocked up in Hong Kong and she's African American and she had a miscarriage and she didn't know what to do. So she put the baby in the dumpster and they found it and identified it and she got arrested. So like from that to the men who, worked for witch doctors in Cape Town, South Africa, and had to go and do some pretty sketchy things just to get certain body parts for the witch doctor. Like I've heard so many stories, and you don't have to have a crazy story for God to use you. Because if you have a story of protection and whatever, God can use that too, because that's a story of protection. But I think that there's power in sharing these stories because many times when you share your story, it also enables people to know that they're not alone in their own story. Or they're like, oh man, if he can share that, then maybe I can share my story too. And so that's kind of like the hope behind this is a lot of times one-on-one we'll share our stories with each other behind closed doors with one person if you really feel like you can trust them. But I just want people to know sometimes you got to be wise when you share your story and who you share it with in the beginning. Because some people don't respond the nicest way or they don't know how to respond or hold space. But the more you share your story, the more freedom is there. And then eventually you get to a place where like, no, this is my story and I'm stewarding it in a way that's honorable, not just to me, but to God. And God gets the glory in all the things that he's brought me through. It's in my weakness that he is strong. It has nothing to do with me. Like actually when I'm weak and jacked up and messy and I'm a basket case, he gets more of the glory because he's the one that brought me through this.
And you never know by sharing your story how it's going to impact someone else.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah.
All right, so we have a few more minutes, and I know that you've spoken a couple of times about being in the industry, but I figured I would ask you, like, what was your role, and maybe show the viewers about, like, that aspect of your life that did sort of lead you to this role you now have today, helping so many other people.
Yeah. So I know when people hear the industry, they're like, what is that? Were you a stripper or a prostitute or whatever? And I was not. I was a cocktail waitress, and I never share the place that I worked at just because I ain't trying to get sued out here. But I did work in this industry. It was not something that I ever thought I would do. I'm a very modest person. Like, cover me up. I'll wear so many clothes. I like to wear clothes. But I had friends who worked in that industry. I graduated from college in 2008. I have a Spanish translating degree and an English degree and could not get a job. Like, nobody was hiring. I'm sure you guys remember the recession. Like, it was worse than, like, probably one of the worst recessions since the Great Depression. Like, it was rough out in these streets. And I could not get a job. And one of my friends was just like, come work here. And I was like, I would never work in a place like that. And it wasn't that I judged the people that worked there. I mean, part of me probably did, in all honesty, if I go back really through it. But it was more of like I would just never bear myself in that way. And I continued applying to jobs. I probably applied to 200 jobs, never even got a call back, nothing. And finally, I went and applied. I got a job there, and I was just like, I'm just going to work here until I get on my feet. But then you make some good money, okay? Like, when you're 21 years old and you're bringing home $900 in one night, that's good money. And so I feel like what this industry looks like is it's very vast. I mean, there's a lot of times people see places like restaurants, or we call them restaurants because that's real, but like Hooters and that kind of thing. I don't know. There's a lot of them like that. And then you have strip clubs, and then you have escorts, and you have all these things. But a lot of times the things that don't seem so bad, like restaurants, are actually the gateway to the sex industry. And you may find yourself being just a server in that place, but it opens doors to other avenues. And there's also people who come into those spaces and they want you to be an escort for them, or, the people that I worked with, they were intelligent women. I mean, one graduated from Brown University. They were very intelligent. They were hustlers. A lot of the people that I was close with, they didn't do drugs and all of that, because I was just like, oh, if you work in that industry, you're probably just strung out on cocaine, But when I lived with these women, and I was one, I was no better than anybody else. I was just ignorant to the fact that, we're all, some of us are really smart, actually, and funny. But I worked in that industry, and even in the industry, I never had sex with anybody. I never got intimate with anybody. It's crazy because I was in a really abusive relationship at the time, and I call him, he was more like a pimp than a prince. That's kind of like the verbiage that I use. And he encouraged me to work in that industry. He called me his sugar mama. And I did pay for everything. I could probably own a house in the things that I paid for just in the first 2 years for him alone. But in that industry, you are open to a lot of different things. So like at one point, somebody came in and was like, hey, we would love to have you in a porn. It's not a big deal. We'll pay you $60K for a one-time recording. So you're open to all these things. And that's not obviously something that I ever did. I said, definitely not. You can catch me outside. But I did have friends who did go down these avenues. And then it opens you up to, a lot of times people are like, hey, we just want to photograph you. And then you're getting bamboozled out here, or they try to traffic you. And so there's a lot of different things that happen in that industry. And it doesn't just have to be in the red light district at a brothel. Like, it could happen in a place that you least expect, where you just think you're going to eat dinner, or, in a strip club, you're not the stripper, but you're the cocktail waitress just walking around or whatever. And so, I worked in that industry, but I also feel like God hid me in plain sight because nothing ever touched me. I mean, I was a virgin when I left that industry. I had never had sex with anybody because that was something that I wanted to keep for myself and for the man that I was going to marry. I'd never been sexually assaulted. Nothing ever happened to me in that industry, which I really see it as God. It's like he put a bubble around me, and I had his protection over me, even though I wasn't walking with him at all. But in that industry too, we're all broken, in some way. Because I always say it's one thing to be so, not even insecure, but to sell yourself. But it's another level of brokenness to buy a human. And I saw that because I saw the men coming in. And a lot of times the men just wanted somebody to listen to them. It wasn't always a physical thing. It was like, my wife won't even listen to me. Can you just listen? And so there's so many things that educated me in that way of what was happening in the world. But also there was this idea that men are pigs. All the good men are taken. And I think a big part of that was the guy that I loved encouraging me to maintain the sale. And I was just like, well, that's not love. Love covers you up. It doesn't put you for sale on a stage. And so, yeah, I think that was a big part of my story of walking out of that industry, gaining, going through the healing from what I experienced in that industry, knowing that not all people are the same. Not all men are pigs. And that brokenness, there's a lot of places that brokenness shows up. And yeah.
Fascinating. Did you work in Amsterdam ever?
No, I never worked in Amsterdam, but I did go there a few times.
Yeah.
I
was curious because I know another girl who's about to go to Amsterdam soon to work in that industry and sort of both witness to the girls, but also talk to the men. Yeah. So.
Yeah, it's awesome. And it's one of those things that even on social media, I was pretty vocal about working in that industry, and somebody reached out to me. Because when you're vulnerable about your story and you don't carry shame in it, people are inspired to share things with you that they probably wouldn't. And so back in 2017, somebody messaged me and was like, right now I'm in this industry And how did you leave? And I walked this woman that I didn't even know through a season of, hey, you don't have to strip anymore. You can be a cocktail waitress. And then she became a door girl. And then she eventually left the industry completely. And I think even in that, it's not like you're a bunch of broken. We are broken. We all have broken bits in our lives, but I didn't choose to walk in that industry because I was broken. I just had no options. And I think a lot of people, they end up in spaces and places because of whatever. There's no formula. You know, some people ended up there because it was a recession and that was just the reality. And then you kind of get sucked in and you do nightlife and you do, you know, I was escorting and I didn't even know I was escorting. I was with NFL players and I thought it was cool because I was like, oh, I'm with these famous people and we're making guest appearances. Little did I know that one of the girls was getting the paycheck for bringing all of us there. And so a lot of the things that I ended up in, I was so innocent and almost naive to the things that were happening around me. And thank God nothing, you know, super crazy happened. But I think even in that, when I became a missionary, some of my biggest donors were the women who were still working in that industry. And so it's kind of like they paid the way for me to go and love the people. Wow. And I remember even working in that industry and being like, what would it have been like for somebody to come in here and be like, do you know that you're loved? You know, it would have just really impacted me in such a positive way. And so I think in life in general, whether you work in the sex industry or whatever you work, you could work in corporate America, being awake and paying attention to people and giving them a word of encouragement or just being like, hey, I see you, you know, is so impactful.
Cool. Well, thank you for sharing that side of your story, because I know that is a level of vulnerability, but it really tells the whole picture about how you went from that and then have really changed the world and your story and by sharing what you've gone through and helping others. It's really beautiful. And I feel blessed that you came and shared it with our audience today. So thank you for coming today.
Yeah, absolutely.
And where can everyone find you online if they want to keep up with your future?
Yeah, so I'm on Instagram. AUBRAYS is my handle. Rooftop Culture Podcast will be live. It'll be attached to my Instagram soon.
Yeah.
And that's basically it. I mean, awesome. I'm across all platforms, but it's the same.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much for joining us today on Leaving a Legacy. And it was a blessing to get to hear your story firsthand.
Thanks for having me.
Yeah, of course.